Tom Baker stood at the edge of his land as the early morning sun cast long shadows across the fields. The dew still clung to the grass, sparkling like tiny diamonds. He took a deep breath of the fresh country air and smiled. This place, these 15 acres on the outskirts of Pine Valley, was everything he'd ever wanted. 3 years ago, Tom had been stuck in a cramped apartment in the city, spending his days in an office cubicle pushing papers. Each night he'd come home and look through real estate listings, dreaming of open spaces and the simple life he remembered from childhood visits to his grandparents' farm. When he finally found this place, 15 acres with an old farmhouse and a big solid barn, he knew it was meant to be his. "Best decision I ever made," Tom said to himself as he walked across the field toward the barn. His boots left wet footprints in the grass behind him. The old farmhouse had needed a lot of work. When Tom first bought the place, the roof leaked. In 3 places the plumbing was a nightmare, and the kitchen looked like something from the 1970s. But Tom was good with his hands. He'd spent weekends and evenings fixing up the place, keeping the charming old wooden beams while putting in a new kitchen and bathrooms. "Morning, boys," Tom called out as he swung open the heavy barn door. 5 massive heads turned toward him, their big brown eyes curious and gentle despite their enormous size. These were Tom's pride and joy, 5 purebred Angus bulls, each one weighing close to 3,000 pounds. They were like big, furry mountains with legs. "Who's hungry?" Tom asked. Grabbing a pitchfork and filling the feeding troughs with fresh hay, the bulls moved forward, their heavy hooves making dull thuds on the barn floor. Tom had named each one after his favorite baseball players: Hank, Babe, Lou, Willie, and Jackie. As he moved among them, he patted their broad sides and talked to them like they were old friends. "You guys don't care about paperwork or traffic jams, do you?" he said. Babe, the largest bull with a white spot on his forehead, snorted in response. Tom laughed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Tom had started raising these bulls for breeding 2 years ago. It was good business. Farmers would pay good money to have their cows bred with quality bulls like these. But it was more than just business to Tom. He genuinely loved these animals, their quiet strength and gentle nature. He'd spent countless hours reading books about cattle raising, talking to old-timers in the area, making sure he was giving his bulls the best care possible. The real estate agent who'd sold Tom the property had gone on and on about the peace and quiet, the freedom to do what he wanted with his own land. "No neighbors breathing down your neck," she'd said. "No city rules telling you what color to paint your house." What she hadn't mentioned, and what Tom only discovered after signing all the papers, was that his rural paradise actually sat just within the boundaries of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at first. The HOA fees were reasonable, and for the first 2 years nobody bothered him. The previous HOA board had always given the more rural properties at the edge of their jurisdiction a pass on many of the stricter rules. Every morning followed the same peaceful routine. Tom would wake up with the sun, make a pot of strong coffee, and head out to tend to his bulls. Afterward, he'd work on whatever house project was next on his list or handle the small business he ran from home, designing websites for local businesses. It was a good life, simple but satisfying. Sometimes in the evenings, he'd sit on his porch with a cold beer, watching the sunset and feeling like the luckiest man alive. Then 6 months ago, everything changed. The old HOA board president, a reasonable older gentleman named Bill who'd lived in the area all his life, retired and moved to Florida. The new president was Diane Harper, a former corporate executive from the city who'd moved to Pine Valley for what she called the country aesthetic. Though her idea of country living was a 5-bedroom house with a perfectly manicured lawn and not a speck of dirt in sight. Tom first met Diane at the annual HOA meeting, which he'd attended mainly for the free donuts. She'd looked at him with his worn jeans and work boots like he was something the cat had dragged in. "You're the one with the farm animals, aren't you?" she'd asked, her voice making it sound like he was keeping tigers in his backyard. "Bulls," Tom had replied with a friendly smile. "I raise Angus bulls for breeding. You should come by sometime and see them. They're really gentle giants." Diane had just sniffed and moved on. Tom had shrugged it off. Some city folks never got comfortable with farm animals, and that was fine. But a week later, the first notice arrived in his mailbox. It was printed on bright yellow paper with violation stamped across the top. According to the notice, his fence was 2 inches taller than HOA regulations allowed. Tom had scratched his head at that one. The fence had been there when he bought the place, and nobody had said a word about it for 3 years. 2 days after that, another yellow notice appeared. This time, his mailbox was apparently the wrong shade of black. Tom didn't even know there were different shades of black. The third notice was what really got under his skin. Unauthorized agricultural activities, it read. Livestock not approved by the architectural committee. Tom had called the HOA office right away. "I've had these bulls for 2 years, he explained to the board-sounding secretary. "Nobody's ever said anything before." "New board, new enforcement," was the only reply he got. That night, Tom sat at his kitchen table with a growing stack of yellow notices and a sinking feeling in his stomach. The home he'd worked so hard for, his peaceful little corner of the world, was suddenly feeling a lot less peaceful. He looked out the window toward the barn where his 5 bulls were settling in for the night, unaware that their very presence was now considered a violation. "Don't worry, boys," Tom muttered. "I'm not giving up without a fight." Little did he know just how literal that fight would become, or that his gentle giants would soon play a starring role in a showdown that would have the whole county talking. The yellow notices kept coming. Tom started keeping them in a folder he labeled HOA Nonsense. By the end of the month, the folder was getting thick. "You can't have hay bales visible from the community access road," read one notice. "Your barn exceeds permitted dimensions for outdoor structures," claimed another. "All livestock facilities must be approved by the architectural committee," a third one insisted. Tom tried calling the HOA office several times, but Diane was always in a meeting or unavailable. He finally resorted to writing polite letters explaining that his property was primarily agricultural, and that his bulls weren't just pets, but part of his livelihood. One crisp fall morning, Tom was in the barn, brushing Hank's thick coat when he heard tires on his gravel driveway. He stepped out to see a shiny black SUV with Pine Valley Estates printed on the door. Diane Harper stepped out, wearing spotless rubber boots that looked like they'd never seen actual mud and carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Baker," she said without smiling, "I've come to inspect the violations personally." Tom wiped his hands on his jeans and tried to be friendly. "Morning, Mrs. Harper. Would you like some coffee? We could sit down and talk about whatever concerns you have." Diane ignored his offer. "Our records show you failed to respond to 11 separate violation notices. I sent letters explaining." "Letters are not the proper form of response," Diane cut in. "There are official HOA forms for disputing violations." She looked past him at the barn. "I need to document the unauthorized livestock facility." Tom's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice calm. "Look, Mrs. Harper, these bulls have been here for years. The previous board never had any issue with them. The previous board was lax in enforcement. Things are different now." She tried to step around him toward the barn. Tom moved to block her path, not aggressively, just standing his ground. "I'm sorry, but you can't go in there without my permission. Those are valuable breeding bulls and they don't know you." Diane's face reddened. "As HOA president, I have the right to inspect any external structures visible from community property." "Not without the owner's permission, you don't," Tom replied. "Now, I'm happy to discuss this civilly, but those bulls are worth over $20,000 each, and I don't let strangers near them." "We'll see about that," Diane snapped, then turned and marched back to her SUV, gravel crunching under her pristine boots. Tom watched her drive away, the knot in his stomach growing tighter. He pulled out his phone and called his buddy Rick, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm in town. "Hey, Rick," Tom said when his friend answered. "Remember how you offered to help if I ever needed legal advice? Well, I think that time has come." The following Saturday, Rick came over with a stack of papers and legal books. They sat at Tom's kitchen table going through county regulations and HOA bylaws line by line. "So here's the deal," Rick said eventually, pushing his glasses up on his nose. Your property does fall within HOA boundaries technically, but there's good news. The county has special zoning laws for agricultural properties that override a lot of HOA restrictions. So they can't make me get rid of my bulls? Tom asked, relief washing over him. Not only that, Rick said with a grin, but most of these violations they're citing don't apply to you because of your agricultural status. The fence height, the barn dimensions, even the hay bales, all protected under county agricultural exemptions. Tom slapped the table. That's what I've been trying to tell them. They're counting on you not knowing your rights, Rick explained. HOAs can be like that. They throw around official-sounding language and hope people just pay the fines without questioning. With Rick's help, Tom drafted a formal letter citing the specific county codes that exempted his property from many HOA regulations. He sent it via certified mail so Diane couldn't claim she never received it. A week passed with no response. Then 2. Tom began to hope that maybe the matter was settled. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, a thick envelope arrived. In his mailbox, inside was a notice that the fines had been doubled, plus a new violation. Creation of noxious odors affecting community enjoyment of shared spaces. Noxious odors? Tom muttered in disbelief. They're bulls, not chemical weapons, he called Rick immediately. They can't do that, Rick assured him after hearing about the doubled fines. They're just trying to intimidate you. We should file a formal complaint with the county housing board. How long will that take? Tom asked. Honestly, months probably. The system isn't exactly speedy. Tom ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I don't have months. These fines are adding up to thousands of dollars now. Don't pay them, Rick advised. They'd have to take you to court to enforce them, and they know they'd lose because of the agricultural exemptions. The next day, Tom was at the feed store in town when his phone rang. It was his neighbor, Frank, an older man who lived a quarter-mile down the road. Tom, Frank said, his voice urgent. You better get back here. That HOA lady and 2 others just drove onto your property. They've got clipboards and cameras. Tom's blood ran cold. Are you sure? Sure as shootin', Frank replied. I was out walking my dog and saw them pull in. They're wearing matching shirts with some kind of logo. Looked mighty official. I'll be right there, Tom said, already heading for the checkout. Can you keep an eye on them until I get back? Will do, Frank promised. I don't like the looks of this, Tom. They're acting like they own the place. Tom paid for his supplies in record time and threw everything into his truck. As he sped home, his mind raced with questions. What were they doing on his property without permission? What gave them the right to trespass like this? The 15-minute drive felt like hours. Tom gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. All he could think about was protecting his home and his bulls from whatever Diane Harper had planned. Hold on, boys, he muttered as he turned onto his road. I'm coming. He had no idea that what was about to happen would turn his quiet fight with the HOA into the talk of the entire county. Tom's truck skidded on the gravel as he pulled into his driveway. Frank was waiting by the mailbox, his old border collie sitting patiently at his feet. They're still here, Frank said, pointing toward the barn. Parked their fancy SUV right on your grasp and taking pictures of everything. Thanks for keeping watch, Tom said, clapping the older man on the shoulder. I'll handle it from here. Frank nodded. Want me to stick around, in case you need a witness? Might not be a bad idea, Tom agreed. As they walked toward the barn, Tom spotted 3 people in matching light blue polo shirts with Pine Valley HOA embroidered on the chest. Diane Harper was easy to pick out. She was pointing at something on the barn while a heavy-set man with a receding hairline took photos. A thin woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun was writing furiously on a clipboard. Hey, Tom called out. What do you think you're doing on my property? All 3 turned, and Diane stepped forward. Mr. Baker, she said with a thin smile, we're conducting an official HOA inspection. Not without my permission, you're not, Tom replied. This is private property. We left messages informing you of today's inspection, the heavy-set man said. I'm Roger Thomas, head of the Enforcement Committee. And I'm Patricia Allen, Committee Secretary, the thin woman added. Everything we're doing is by the book. I never got any messages about an inspection, Tom said. And even if I had, you still need my permission to be here. Diane pulled a folder from her clipboard. Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the HOA covenant clearly states that the board has the right to inspect properties with outstanding violations after providing 48-hour notice. Which you didn't provide, Tom pointed out. We left voicemails, Patricia insisted. Tom pulled out his phone. No, you didn't, not a single message. Roger stepped closer to Tom, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. Listen, Baker, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. We're just doing our job. Frank, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Seems to me you folks are trespassing. That's against the law, HOA or not. Diane glared at Frank. And you are? Frank Johnson. I live down the road. Known Tom here since he moved in. Good neighbor. Takes care of his animals better than most people take care of their kids. This doesn't concern you, Mr. Johnson, Diane said dismissively. Actually, I think it might concern the sheriff, Frank replied. Should I give him a call? Tom appreciated Frank's support but wanted to handle this calmly. Look, he said to Diane, I understand you have a job to do, but let's do this properly. We can schedule an inspection for tomorrow if you want. But you need to leave now. For a moment it looked like Diane might agree. Then she shook her head. We're already here. We have documentation of multiple violations visible from public areas. Now we need to complete our inspection, which includes the barn structure. The barn is off limits, Tom said firmly. There are 5 breeding bulls in there worth over $100,000 total. Only people with livestock experience are allowed inside. Bulls? Patricia's eyes widened. Don't worry, Diane said to her. They're probably in stalls. She turned back to Tom. Mr. Baker, we have the authority to inspect all structures on HOA properties. If you interfere, you'll be in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 7. Tom was about to respond when his phone rang. It was Joe, his part-time farmhand who helped on weekends. Boss, Joe said when Tom answered, I'm running late for feeding, got caught in traffic. Be there in about an hour. No rush, Tom replied, keeping his eyes on the HOA trio. I'll handle the feeding today. He hung up and addressed Diane again. My property has agricultural exemptions under County Code 4753. I've sent you documentation proving this. Now please leave. We'll be filing an additional violation for obstruction, Roger said, his face reddening. Tom felt his own temper rising but kept his voice steady. File whatever you want, but you need to leave, now. After we inspect the barn, Diane insisted. Tom stepped between them and the barn door. Absolutely not. Those bulls don't know you and they can be territorial with strangers. We have every right, Diane began. You have no right to risk your safety or my animals, Tom cut in. Frank moved to stand beside Tom. You heard the man. Time for you folks to go. Diane looked from Tom to Frank, then at her watch. Fine. We'll postpone the barn inspection, but we're documenting your refusal to cooperate. She made a show of writing something on her clipboard. Document. Away, Tom said. Just do it from your side of my property line. The 3 HOA members finally started walking back toward their SUV. Tom and Frank followed at a distance to make sure they actually left. This isn't over, Diane called over her shoulder. Not by a long shot. Once the SUV pulled away, Tom let out a long breath. Thanks, Frank, I appreciate the backup. Anytime, Frank said. Those HOA types can be real pains in the behind. My sister lives in one of those fancy developments, and they fined her for planting the wrong color roses. Tom shook his head. I need to feed the boys, he said, referring to his bulls. Want to come in for a coffee after? Sounds good, Frank agreed. Tom unlocked the barn door and went inside, closing it behind him. The familiar smell of hay and cattle greeted him, and the 5 bulls looked up with interest, hoping for their afternoon meal. You guys missed all the excitement, Tom told them as he started filling their feed troughs. After finishing the chores and making sure all the bulls were fed and watered, Tom locked up the barn and headed back to the house with Frank. As they sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, Tom filled his neighbor in on all the HOA drama of the past few months. "You should put up cameras," Frank suggested. "Way they were acting. Wouldn't surprise me if they tried coming back when you're not home." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's not a bad idea. I've been meaning to get a security system anyway." Little did Tom know how important that advice would prove to be, because even as they sat drinking coffee, Diane Harper was already making plans with Roger and Patricia for their next move, one that would transform a simple neighborhood dispute into something much more serious. 3 days later, Tom installed a comprehensive security system with cameras covering his driveway, the area around the barn, and the barn interior. He also added a new heavy-duty padlock to the barn door. "Let's see them try anything now," he muttered to himself as he tested the new setup on his phone. The crisp, clear images of his property gave him a sense of security he hadn't felt in weeks. He had no idea that within 24 hours those cameras would capture footage that would change everything. Tom woke up early the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing repeatedly. It was a notification from his new security system. Still half asleep, he tapped the app and saw something that made him bolt upright in bed. The camera feed showed 3 familiar figures approaching his barn in the dim morning light. Diane, Roger, and Patricia were back, this time dressed in dark clothing rather than their HOA polo shirts. Tom checked the timestamp. 5:42 a.m. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, quickly pulling on his jeans and boots. By the time he got the app working properly to see the live feed, Diane was holding something in her hands. Tom squinted at the screen. Were those bolt cutters? His question was answered a moment later when Diane handed the tool to Roger, who positioned it around the padlock on the barn door. Tom watched in disbelief as Roger cut through his brand-new padlock. The heavy metal fell to the ground and Diane picked it up, tucking it into her pocket. Tom grabbed his truck keys and phone, but before rushing out he remembered to tap the record button on the security app. Whatever happened next, he wanted it documented. As he sprinted toward his truck, he saw Patricia pull out a piece of paper and hold it up toward the camera, as if showing some kind of official document. Then all 3 entered his barn, closing the door behind them. Tom's heart raced as he started his truck. Those bulls weren't used to strangers, especially not one sneaking in at dawn. He lived only a few minutes from his barn, which was on the far end of his property, but it felt like the longest drive of his life. As he sped down his long driveway, Tom glanced at his phone again. The interior barn camera was showing all 3 HOA members standing just inside the door. They were looking around with flashlights, their faces showing a mixture of smugness and uncertainty. The bulls, normally docile, were beginning to stir, disturbed by the unfamiliar voices and lights. Tom was about halfway to the barn when he saw Hank, the largest and most protective of his bulls, rise to his feet. The massive animal turned toward the intruders, his head lowered slightly, a posture Tom recognized as a warning sign. "Oh no," Tom said to himself, pressing harder on the gas pedal. On the small screen of his phone, he could see Patricia pointing, her flashlight directly at Hank, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. The bull took a step forward, and then another. Roger noticed the movement and grabbed Diane's arm. Tom could just make out his panicked words. "Is that one loose? I thought they'd be in stalls." Tom had designed his barn with an open floor plan for the bulls, giving them plenty of room to move around. They had separate areas for feeding and sleeping, but no actual stalls or gates within the barn. It allowed them to live more naturally and reduced stress. Now, however, all 5 bulls were awake and alert, their massive bodies moving with surprising grace as they focused on the intruders. Even through the small phone screen, Tom could see the moment when the realization hit the 3 HOA members. They were in a confined space with 5 animals weighing over 3,000 pounds each, with nothing between them. What happened next would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. Diane was the first to react, turning so quickly she slipped on the straw-covered floor. She scrambled up and pushed past Roger, who was frozen in place. Patricia was already backing toward the door, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Tom arrived at the barn just in time to see all 3 burst through the door in a chaotic rush. Diane was in the lead, her usually perfect hair now full of straw. She didn't even see Tom as she sprinted toward the SUV they'd parked nearby. Roger came next, moving faster than seemed possible for a man of his size. He had lost one of his shoes, somewhere in the barn, and was limping slightly. Patricia brought up the rear, having lost her clipboard but gained a look of pure terror. Tom calmly stepped out of his truck and approached the barn. Inside, he found his bulls clustered together, looking more confused than agitated. Hank, the big troublemaker, was already settling back down in his favorite spot. "Good boys," Tom said soothingly, checking to make sure none were upset. "Everything's okay." Outside, the 3 HOA members had reached their vehicle but seemed to be arguing about something. Diane was frantically searching her pockets, her face growing increasingly panicked. Tom realized she must have dropped the barn padlock during their hasty retreat. "Looking for something?" Tom called out, walking toward them with his phone held up, still recording. Diane's head snapped up. "You!" she sputtered. "Your dangerous animals nearly killed us." Tom kept his voice calm. "My bulls were right where they belong, in their barn. You 3, on the other hand, broke my lock and trespassed on private property at dawn, which, by the way, I have recorded from multiple angles." He held up his phone as evidence. "We have every right," Roger began, but Tom cut him off. "Save it. You had bolt cutters and broke in before 6 a.m. That's not an inspection, that's breaking and entering." Patricia, who seemed the most shaken of the 3, spoke up. "We had official HOA authorization." Her voice trembled slightly. "Let me guess," Tom replied. "A piece of paper Diane typed up herself? That's not a legal warrant, and you know it." Diane, trying to regain her composure, straightened her jacket. "We'll be filing a complaint about those dangerous animals. They should be kept in secure enclosures." "They were in a secure enclosure," Tom pointed out. "You broke into it." "This isn't over," Diane said, yanking open the SUV door. "Oh, I think it is," Tom replied, holding up his phone again. "Breaking and entering is a criminal offense, and I've got the whole thing on video." For the first time since he'd met her, Diane seemed at a loss for words. She climbed into the SUV without another retort, and Roger and Patricia quickly followed. They drove away, leaving behind a trail of dust and one of Roger's expensive loafers. Tom went back to check on his bulls once more, then called Frank. "You're not gonna believe what just happened," he said when his neighbor answered. "Try me," Frank replied, sounding like he was already on his second cup of coffee. "The HOA goons broke into my barn at dawn with bolt cutters, and the bulls gave them quite a welcome." Frank's laugh boomed through the phone. "Tell me you got it on those cameras." "Every second," Tom confirmed. "Even got them admitting why they were here." "What are you gonna do?" Frank asked. Tom looked at the broken padlock lying in the dirt. "First, I'm putting on a stronger lock. Then I'm calling Rick and asking what the legal term is for breaking into someone's property with tools at dawn." "I believe that's called asking for trouble," Frank said, "and looks like they found it." As Tom picked up the pieces of his cut padlock, he couldn't help but smile despite the intrusion. The 3 HOA members had finally gone too far, and they'd done it all on camera. That afternoon, he sent the video footage to Rick, who responded with a message that simply read, "They're toast.